Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I will never forget the exact moment I found out about the Hawaii trip, not because the news was delivered to me directly, but because it slipped out in the most careless way, like I was never meant to know in the first place. As if my existence could be conveniently overlooked when the family was planning something grand. My cousin, who clearly assumed I was already in the loop, casually mentioned how jealous she was that our parents were flying everyone out for a Christmas in Maui, and she joked about how I'd better pack enough sunscreen. I remember laughing weakly, my stomach turning cold, because I had no idea what she was talking about, and I brushed it off until I had the chance to call my mother later that night. When I asked her directly, I heard her take the kind of pause that tells you everything before words even follow, and then she said something I can never unhear. "Well, honey, we didn't think you'd really want to come. And besides, your sister felt it would be better if it was just her family this year." The way she said it, soft, apologetic, but at the same time final, was like a slap across the face. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, my mouth open but no words forming, because how do you respond when your own parents admit that your sister had asked them to exclude you from Christmas? She had asked, and they had agreed, without a second thought. They didn't fight for me. They didn't insist that Christmas should include everyone. They simply nodded along because apparently her happiness outweighed mine. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the realization that this had probably been decided long before I ever asked, and nobody had planned on telling me until the family photos started hitting social media. As I listened to my mother try to explain, something inside me hardened. She said my sister thought I would bring tension to the trip, that I might make things uncomfortable, and that it was easier this way. Easier for who? For the sister who has spent her entire adult life manipulating every room she walks into? For the parents who are so terrified of upsetting her that they bend over backwards to accommodate every unreasonable request? Meanwhile, I was left sitting alone in my living room, staring at the Christmas lights I had strung up myself, realizing that not only was I unwanted, but that my family hadn't even considered how it would feel to cut me out. I could hear the faint sound of laughter in the background of the call, my father, probably sitting with my sister and her husband while the trip was being discussed, and my mother whispered that she had to go because everyone's here right now, which only added to the sting. Everyone was there except me. I hung up and sat in silence, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind, trying to decide if this was a moment to cry, to scream, or to finally start keeping a mental tally of every slight I had tolerated over the years. My mind went back to all the times I had sacrificed for my family without complaint, the weekends I spent helping my parents with their house repairs while my sister was too busy, the holidays where I stayed behind to dog sit so the rest could travel freely. The financial help I had quietly given my sister when her husband lost his job and they were too proud to ask our parents. Every memory now felt poisoned, tainted by the knowledge that none of it counted, none of it made me valuable enough to deserve inclusion. Instead, my sister's comfort mattered more than my presence, and my parents were perfectly fine with erasing me from the family Christmas. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and sat staring at the ceiling, the string of lights glowing faintly against the window, and I asked myself how long I had been playing the role of the quiet, accommodating sibling, the one who didn't stir trouble, the one who let insults slide because that's just how she is. My sister has always been the queen bee, the center of attention, the one who could make people bend to her will, but I had never expected that my parents would go so far as to exile me from Christmas at her request. The irony wasn't lost on me that while she was busy arranging a vacation where I wasn't welcome, she and her husband were still comfortably living under my roof, eating my groceries, and driving my patience to the limit every single day. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes I pictured them lounging in Hawaii while I sat at home, pretending to enjoy a quiet holiday. I imagined the photos they would take on the beach, my parents grinning with leis around their necks, my sister's smug smile as she posed with her children, and the captions that would flood Facebook about family time in paradise. And in each picture, my absence would scream louder than anything else, a permanent reminder that I had been written out by my own blood. As dawn crept through the blinds, I realized there was no universe where I could continue pretending that this was acceptable. Something had snapped in me, something that wouldn't be mended with a phone call or an apology. I had given too much, tolerated too much, and now the price was being paid in humiliation and silence. My sister thought she had won by shutting me out of Hawaii, but she had underestimated me. She had forgotten that her cozy living arrangement depended entirely on me, that every free night she spent in my guest room and every meal she pulled from my fridge was courtesy of the sister she decided wasn't good enough for Christmas. And as I stood in the kitchen staring at the half-empty carton of milk her husband had left on the counter again, I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't going to stay quiet this time. Something was about to change, and it wouldn't be me begging for an invitation to Hawaii. It would be them, begging for a roof over their heads, and for the first time in years, I smiled at the thought. The morning after the call with my mother, I stood in my kitchen and watched steam rise from the coffee like a signal flare announcing that truce time had ended. Because somewhere between the bitter taste and the first swallow, I decided I would stop pretending that generosity was being misunderstood when in reality it was being mined like a free resource. And I would stop being the quiet host who apologized for her own boundaries as if limits were rude while entitlement was charming. My sister Caroline and her husband Nate had arrived a year ago with suitcases and stories, the kind that come padded with phrases like temporary and just until we get back on our feet. Except feet apparently can relax for a very long time when someone else pays for the floor, the roof, the utilities, and the groceries, and when the house happens to be mine, paid for with my overtime, my careful budgeting, my used furniture that I refinished on weekends while they lounged on it like it was a showroom they were helping me test. It began with small courtesies that felt humane. Take my guest room, keep your savings intact, use the laundry, make yourselves at home, and then slowly swelled into a routine where my car key went missing because Nate took the Civic, just for a quick errand. My shampoo was mysteriously half-empty because Caroline liked my brand, and the refrigerator developed a vanishing act where leftovers evaporated whenever I told anyone at work I was bringing lunch tomorrow. If I ever brought up the strain with my parents, they did what parents who have a favorite often do. They wrapped Caroline in soft explanations about stress and sensitive nerves, and how she had always taken things to heart, as though her delicate feelings were a medical condition requiring me to subsidize rent and emotional management, while my own patience was treated like a renewable resource grown on trees behind the garage. The truth, which I can say out loud now because the door finally opened in my mind, is that I had been paying for the privilege of being considered sturdy, paying with silence, with groceries, with gas, with time, because being the reliable one made me the easiest to use. Caroline and Nate argued loudly at night about bills and job prospects and whether stability was even possible anymore, and then in the morning they would pad into the kitchen barefoot, cheerful as if the shouting had been part of some cardio plan, and ask if I could spot them for the phone plan. This month, because switching carriers had unexpected fees, while Nate sagely explained that cash flow in this economy was like the tides, unpredictable and frankly unfair. When I got home that afternoon and found my cast iron skillet soaking in the sink like a drowned artifact from a shipwreck, which any sentient adult knows you never do to cast iron, I realized that my generosity had reached the phase where inanimate objects were sending distress signals, and I dried it off and re-seasoned it with the same care I wished I had shown myself months earlier. I made a list on a yellow legal pad that looked old school and authoritative, the kind of pad lawyers hold when they dismantle a story, and at the top I wrote house terms effective immediately. And under that I wrote rent due on the first measured at half of market, because I am not a tyrant, utilities split by 3, groceries labeled and respected, car off limits, quiet hours after 11, and most importantly, a written timeline that set a firm move-out date for the week before Thanksgiving. So no one could pretend they misunderstood the calendar. I added one last line that felt like a small, efficient engine purring under the hood. Any violation equals immediate termination of stay, because clarity is kindness, and I had been unintentionally cruel by being vague. When they came home carrying takeout that smelled suspiciously like the pricey type place I reserve for birthdays, I asked them to sit, and I delivered the speech that had been rehearsing itself in my head all day, Not a rant, not a sob. Just a sequence of calm sentences that linked together like a chain that could finally pull me forward. I explained that I knew about the Hawaii trip and that my exclusion clarified things I should have acknowledged sooner, that living in my house was not a birthright awarded to family members with louder opinions, and that generosity is not in Ford drip you hook up indefinitely because it's convenient and warm. Caroline tried to cry in the opening minute the way she always does, cranking the faucet to full, but I didn't hand her the towel. I kept speaking, and Nate attempted the reasonable guy script about teamwork and temporary hardship. But I shared the printed sheet, 2 copies signed and dated, and an envelope with a simple, boring receipt book that I had bought on my lunch break along with a lock for the garage where my tools and boxes live, because boring is the most powerful weapon when people are used to emotional theatrics. They pushed back with the predictable arguments: family shouldn't charge family, holidays are coming, we've almost got a job offer, and I listened with the patience of a nurse checking vitals. Then I pointed to the line about the move-out date and to the words immediate termination, and I told them, kindly and without venom, that if they preferred not to contribute they could be out by the end of the week, and I would even help them load the car. The moment the words left my mouth I felt something unclench between my shoulder blades, a physical release like undoing a stubborn knot, and while Caroline accused me of cruelty and Nate said this would ruin Christmas, I looked at the skillet now gleaming on the stove and offered a small smile that probably annoyed them more than a scream would have. My first act of revenge was almost comically sensible, which somehow made it land harder. I walked to the router, changed the Wi-Fi password to a new phrase that read like a private joke I refused to explain, set up user profiles on the streaming accounts with pin locks, and posted on the fridge a printed QR code that linked to the rent app I'd chosen, with a note that said first payment due in 5 days and that partial payments would be declined because adulthood does not accept store credit. Then I sent a group text to my parents with a photo of the new house term sheet, a message that said I'm safe, I'm calm, and I'm done being your shock absorber. And I turned off my phone for the evening so that no one could negotiate me out of my own decision while the ink was still drying. As I turned out the lights and the house settled around me like a creature stretching after a long nap, I felt a tiny thrill, a pulse of mean little satisfaction. I won't dress up as virtue, because for the first time in a year the balance had tilted even a fraction in my favor, and while that might sound small, it was enough to scare them, which was exactly the point. By the time the first rent deadline came and went with nothing but a breezy, we're moving money around, it'll land tomorrow, I had already rehearsed my lines enough times that my mouth felt like a stage that finally deserved a real performance. So when tomorrow arrived dressed as the same old excuse, I printed a standard notice that any competent adult can find with a 5-minute search, slipped it into a clear sleeve like a calm little blade, and taped it to the inside of the hall closet door where Caroline keeps her stack of tote bags and seasonal scarves, because I wanted her to find it while standing in her usual posture of mild superiority, fishing for an accessory while assuming the house was a buffet that simply replenished itself overnight. She yanked the door open, froze at the plastic sheen of official language, and turned to me with the expression of a queen discovering taxes, while Nate wandered in holding a cereal bowl filled to the rim with my granola as if portion control were an insult to his birthright. I did not raise my voice. I read the paper out loud in a level tone that could have sold insurance, explaining the new reality in terms that had no adjectives, only dates and consequences, and when Caroline tried to pretend she didn't understand, I offered a second copy and a pen to initial that she had received it, not because I expected a courtroom scene, but because collecting signatures from people who depend on fog is the simplest way to bring weather to a close. They went straight for the theatrical, Caroline gasping that I was destroying family, Nate delivering a speech about holiday spirit and how this isn't who you are. Which was interesting because they had apparently drafted a version of me that exists solely to provide shelter, Wi-Fi, and a sympathetic brow, and they were very attached to the script. I let them talk, then I asked one question, clear and unadorned. Are you paying today or are you packing this weekend? And the silence that followed was almost elegant, a pause that trimmed a year of noise. Caroline pivoted to character assassination, listing microscopic grievances like how I sometimes wipe the counters with vinegar instead of a real cleaner, how I once forgot to replace the paper towels, how my car smells faintly of peppermint because I like gum, and while she cataloged this as if building a legal case for martyrdom, I walked to the kitchen drawer, retrieved the envelope with the spare keys I had collected that morning, and placed them on the table next to a small laminated card that said guest parking permit cancelled. The permit cancellation was petty in the way that feels medicinal, not because I wanted their sedan to suffer, but because the Homeowners Association has rules that I have followed with almost religious devotion while these two treated them like bedtime suggestions. And I had already emailed the management office explaining that my long-term guests were no longer authorized for overnight parking, which meant that the white car that had lounged by the curb like a lazy dog would now be an unaccompanied vehicle in a neighborhood that enforces bylaws with the enthusiasm of middle school hall monitors. Nate blinked at the card, performed the math slowly, and said my name like a warning, but I kept my voice steady and explained that adults who miss financial deadlines lose privileges before they lose roofs, and today was a privilege day. Predictably, the phones began to light up. First a text from my mother using the kind of punctuation that suggests urgency without information. Then a call from my father that I let ring out while I folded laundry because I refused to be summoned like a firefighter to a blaze I did not set, and then, like clockwork, my mother's long voicemail in which she gently accused me of overreacting while also reminding me that Christmas is about forgiveness, as if forgiveness were an Airbnb coupon code you can enter at checkout to waive rent. I sent one message back, a single sentence that said, "I will speak after Caroline and Nate honor the agreement," and returned to the living room where my sister had begun arranging an audience for herself by opening a social media app and drafting a post about being thrown out right before the holidays, while carefully leaving out the part where she had lobbied to erase me from a beach. I asked her not to post anything with my address in it, and when she rolled her eyes and hit save anyway, I quietly pulled the guest network plug and suggested the public library for connectivity, which was both helpful and, I admit, deeply satisfying. The showdown peaked that evening when the tow truck's amber lights washed over the front window like a weird kind of sunset, because the HOA patrol had indeed noticed the unpermitted car, and, while I did not call anyone myself, that would have been a violation. I did step outside with a calm explanation and a copy of the email from management, which meant the driver nodded, clicked a few buttons, and attached a hook with the efficiency of someone who has met many versions of Nate. The performance that followed could have won a small regional award, Caroline shouting that I was humiliating her, Nate declaring that this would go nuclear, neighbors pretending not to stare behind curtains, and me standing there with my arms crossed, but my mouth soft, telling them that the car would be released when the first rent receipt existed and that, until then, Uber is a thing. My revenge that night was not the tow, though I will not pretend it lacked flavor. It was the email I sent at 10 to a storage company reserving a small unit in my name for 1 month, including a scheduled pickup window for Saturday morning and a note that 2 sealed boxes labeled Caroline Personal and Nate Tools would be ready in the garage, because cutting their chaos into handleable cubes felt like the opposite of cruelty. It felt like administration. I boxed their loose items with care, no petty mixing, no oops your charger vanished, bubble-wrapped the fragile pieces, labeled everything in neat block letters, and added an inventory list to the top of each box with a cheerful line, claim after rent or at move-out, whichever comes first. Then I placed the keys to the storage unit in an envelope on the kitchen island, sealed it, and wrote available upon first payment, a phrase that glowed in my chest like a new pilot light. When midnight came, the house finally quiet except for the sound of my phone vibrating off the edge of the dresser with another call from my parents. I let it ring and ring until voicemail caught it. And I lay there feeling equal parts relief and nausea, because standing up for yourself always arrives with attacks. I pressed play and heard my mother's voice, shaky and unusually careful, saying there were things I didn't know about the Hawaii trip, that it wasn't only Caroline's request, that there had been a conversation I was never supposed to hear about, managing optics, after something Nate did last spring, and that we needed to talk before I made a mistake I couldn't undo. The message ended on a breath, the kind people take before confessing, and I stared at the ceiling while the dark filled in around me, realizing that my tidy little war might be sitting on top of a deeper, messier truth that would not stay buried just because I had finally learned how to tape a notice straight. The voicemail sat in my ear like a splinter I couldn't quite extract, because the phrase, managing optics, does not belong in a family where casseroles and overdue apologies are supposed to fix everything. So the next morning, after a night spent staring at the ceiling fan as if its blades could slice the confusion into digestible pieces, I called my mother and listened while she arranged words the way people set out fragile figurines they hope you won't push off the shelf, telling me there had been a situation last spring involving Nate and a promise to my father that went sideways, that money changed hands in a way that would look bad if anyone who liked gossip connected the dots, and that keeping me out of the Hawaii trip was not about punishing me as much as it was about simplifying the narrative in front of certain relatives who ask weaponized questions, which sounded like public relations talk for the fact that I am the inconvenient witness who doesn't clap on cue. I asked her, very quietly, what exactly had gone sideways, and she said something about a loan that was never technically a loan, and a fix that required fast cash, and an understanding that the easiest way to avoid mess is to keep the person who tidies from seeing the closet, which is an elegant way of saying they didn't want me there because I would notice the stains they were busy Febrizing. By noon my phone had become a haunted object, vibrating with messages that tried to braid guilt and logistics into a rope they could throw around my waist, texts from my father about family unity, and from my mother about holiday grace, and from Caroline that included a screenshot of a half-written social post accusing me of cruelty, but, magnanimously, pausing before tagging my address, and I sat at my table with a notepad and, instead of crying, I did what I always do when the emotional weather turns toward storms. I made a plan with bullet points that felt like raindrops organizing themselves into a predictable pattern. I scheduled the storage pickup for Saturday morning at 9. I booked a locksmith for the 1st of December with a neat line item for new keys and a keypad code I could change from my phone, and I posted a rental listing for the guest suite that called it a sonny-in-law with a private bath and sensible landlord, adding photos that made the space look larger than it is without lying, because I can be petty, but I won't be dishonest, and I opened the calendar for showings Sunday afternoon, which meant the clock had stopped being theoretical and started ticking in a way everyone could hear. When Caroline saw the listing, her face performed a tiny collapse that might have earned sympathy from strangers, except the people who live with her know that collapse is the prelude to attack. And she launched into a monologue about how I was evicting family to make room for strangers who would never love me unconditionally, a sentence so dense with irony I could have used it to patch drywall. I told her that unconditional love does not require rent-free Wi-Fi and an open refrigerator, and that responsibility looks like a calendar, not a Hallmark card, and then, because my revenge prefers paperwork to fireworks, I slid a printed ledger across the table, a tidy spreadsheet of every expense from utilities to groceries to oil changes during the year of their residence, with a balance due highlighted in a cheerful color the app called Mint, and beneath it the stamped small claims filing number I had obtained on my lunch break, not because I salivate at the idea of court, but because consequences make quick learners of people who dismiss words they cannot see. The begging intensified in stages that felt almost textbook. First a plea from my mother to postpone everything until after New Year's when feelings aren't so raw, then a stern lecture from my father about elders deserving respect, and finally a surprising call from one of my aunts who said she had heard a version of my behavior that sounded un-Christmassy, which told me Caroline's public relations arm was working overtime, and I said one sentence that I repeated, calm as a metronome. 2. Everyone who tried to negotiate, I will talk after the first rent payment clears. In the spaces between those calls, I took petty pleasure in small acts of order that doubled as self-rescue, labeling pantry shelves, locking the car keys in a tiny fireproof safe, disabling the guest network and replacing it with a handwritten card that said, available upon receipt, which felt like a spell that turns chaos back into a pumpkin at the exact stroke you choose. Sunday arrived with its open house breeze, a handful of polite strangers drifting through the guest suite while Caroline hovered in the hallway like a ghost who refused to go toward the light, and Nate camped in the driveway pretending to take important calls. And the fourth visitor, a kindergarten teacher named Ruth, stepped into the room and glanced at the doorframe with the kind of cataloging eye I recognize in people who keep classrooms running on thin budgets, then looked at Nate, looked back at me, and said, in a neutral tone that made my skin prickle, that she thought she had seen him at municipal court last May when she was there for a parking dispute, not that it was any of her business. And she apologized for the awkwardness, with a tiny shrug that somehow carried the weight of a document stamped by someone with a seal. I watched the realization flicker across Nate's face like a light you can't quite catch, and I realized managing optics might not have been a euphemism for family gossip, but a practical strategy to keep me away from a story that could unravel with one good tug. My revenge for the day was quiet and, to outsiders, almost boring. At 5 I sent a calendar invite titled Truth Before Turkey to my parents and to Caroline and Nate for Wednesday evening at 6. A meeting request that required an RSVP and included one sentence of agenda that read all topics on the record, no phones, no tap dancing, because the people who weaponize ambiguity tend to fear a clock and a table more than they fear any raised voice. And I added a second attachment, a scanned copy of a notarized letter from me stating that effective December 1st no one other than the leaseholder would be permitted to reside at my address, which meant the days of sentimental squatting were mathematically numbered. At 7, with the house quiet and the open house visitors gone and the listing already receiving 2 follow-ups, I sat on the couch and opened an envelope that had been slid under my door sometime during the afternoon. No return address. Inside a single folded sheet, a pay stub with Nate's name, my address, and a date from late spring, which on its own proved nothing except that unemployment stories age poorly when stapled to wages, and below it, clipped with an irritated little staple, the corner of a police incident card with a case number and the words witness statements on file, scribbled in a hand that looked annoyed and efficient. I stared at those numbers long enough for the room to dim around the edges, because while I had spent days building clean little boxes for their mess, I had just been handed a thread that, if pulled, might unspool the entire family's version of events in front of people who do not care about Christmas or casseroles or optics, and as my phone began buzzing with RSVP acceptances to Truth Before Turkey, I realized I would have to decide whether justice in my house required sunlight everywhere, even if the day it illuminated would never quite feel like a holiday again. Wednesday arrived disguised as an ordinary weekday, except the house knew better, the air carrying that tight, metallic taste rooms get before a thunderstorm, and I set the table the way my mother taught me when I was a teenager, water glasses to the right, napkins folded neatly, chairs square to the edge, because if we were going to excavate a year of rot, we could at least do it without paper plates and shouting from the doorway, and I placed a single folder at each setting like place cards. For Truth, labeled with our names in the same tidy handwriting I use for grocery lists and tax envelopes, because elegance and consequences do not have to be enemies. Caroline arrived first with her apology face already engaged, the one that relies on round eyes and breathy phrases, and Nate followed carrying the heaviness of a man who expects to be handled. And my parents came last with the joint posture of diplomats who would prefer a summit involving cookies, and when everyone sat I pointed to the small basket by the door and said phones, please, which earned me 4 different shades of offense, but the devices went in anyway, because even performers know when the theater asks for quiet. I opened by reading the agenda line exactly as I had written it on the record, no tap dancing, and I slid my ledger forward because numbers, unlike memory, do not wander. Then I set 2 items in the center. The pay stub from late spring with Nate's name and my address and a date that contradicted the claim of catastrophic unemployment, and the clipped police incident card with a case number that twitched like a live wire even while it lay still. My father cleared his throat the way men do when they choose words with tweezers, and he said that things had happened last May that were complicated, and that everyone in this room had made mistakes. and that sometimes protecting family means not announcing every misstep to cousins who gossip at weddings, and he was halfway into a sentence about managing optics when I put up one finger like a traffic officer and asked him whether the money he had loaned Nate was the same money he had pulled from the fund he and my mother used for their annual Christmas trip, because if the answer was yes, then the arithmetic of why I was excluded had just become painfully obvious. The cost of keeping quiet had been paid in airline miles, beach photos, and my absence. Caroline tried to cut in with a narrative about unfair systems and bad luck, but I read the date on the pay stub out loud, then the date on the incident card, and asked why a man with wages in May would be living rent-free in my house in December while my sister curated posts about resilience, and why the witnesses from the incident required optics protection while my presence required erasure. My mother started to cry, a soft, startled sound that still makes my stomach flip even now. And she said they had asked me to stay home from Hawaii because Aunt Marlene would ask too many pointed questions, and I tend to answer those questions like a person who believes sunlight is good. And that the easiest way to survive the holiday without humiliation had seemed, in that short-sighted spring logic, to be carving me out of the picture just long enough for the world to forget the case number. And that the plan had been to make it up to me with a separate trip in the new year, just the two of us, as if a private apology vacation could tidy the feeling of being voted off the island by your own mother. Nate finally spoke, a formal apology wrapped around a refusal to name the word that hovered between us, saying misunderstanding and mistiming, and we consulted an attorney. With the careful diction of a man who has been told which syllables he is allowed to use, and he promised that the first rent payment would hit my account by Friday morning, and that they would choose an extended stay hotel for a month to reset, and that he would personally clear the ledger by spring, and that if the internet needed a villain, he would volunteer to be it, as if martyrdom points could be redeemed for housing. I listened without interrupting because interruption is a species of chaos, and when he finished I slid a new sheet across the table, an updated agreement printed with the same pleasant font I use for holiday recipes. And I explained that Friday's payment would release the storage keys, that the locksmith would come on the 1st and change both locks and code, that Ruth, the kindergarten teacher, would sign the lease on Saturday afternoon with her first month and a deposit already certified, and that if anyone attempted to move a single box back into this house without my signature, I would call the police and read them the case number myself. Not as a threat, but as a final acceptance of the universe, where adults have to speak to officials when the Hallmark version fails. My revenge, which looked boring on paper and vicious in practice, was not only the lease or the locks, it was the envelope addressed to Aunt Marlene sitting in my desk, sealed but unstamped, containing one page with nothing but dates and amounts and the words, "Family story requires revision," because the mere existence of that envelope altered the gravity in the room, a silent planet that pulled everyone's eyes without needing to glow. I did not say I would mail it. I did not say I would not. I simply let its weight live between us while we signed the papers, and for once, silence worked for me. Caroline's voice broke into a new shape, a whispery wrath that lives at the edge of pleading, and she accused me of enjoying their downfall like a sport, which is not totally wrong even if I do not like the mirror it holds up. And she asked whether I was really willing to scorch our parents' reputations just to win a point about rent, and I looked at my mother, whose face had shifted from softness into something older and less breakable, and my mother said to her, in a voice I will not forget, that none of this was about rent anymore, and that she was done paying to keep the wrong stories alive. The meeting ended without a scene, which perversely felt like an anticlimax after all that choreography, and everyone filed out with their folders and their next steps, and the house settled around the quiet like a cat circling its bed. And I poured a glass of wine I did not immediately drink because I wanted to feel my pulse slow without help. At 9 the payment cleared, not because of contrition, because direct deposit does not do morals, it does math, and at 10 Ruth texted that she was ready to sign Saturday, and asked whether she could bring a friend as a witness, and I said of course. And then I turned my phone face down and stood at the window where the streetlight makes the pavement look like a stage, and I considered the envelope to Aunt Marlene and the way its paper had warmed under my fingers during the meeting like a living thing, and I thought about Christmas in Hawaii and the photos that will always have a hole where I should have been, and I realized that revenge had given me a roof and a spine, but not necessarily a map for the rest. The phone began to buzz again, my mother's name, then Caroline's, then a number I did not recognize, and I let it hum until the sound became part of the room, and I held the envelope up to the light as if it might confess its own purpose, and I said out loud, "To no one, that truth has a way of traveling with or without postage," and I slid the envelope back into the drawer and turned the lock, not because I had forgiven anyone, not because I had decided to torch the family tree, but because sometimes the most satisfying ending is not a bang or a bow, it is a lever you leave within reach of your own hand, waiting, patient, ready to be pulled the second piece stops feeling like the right kind of quiet.